In Year 3, welcome to the fourth lesson in our science topic, the life cycle of plants. Today we're going to be learning all about the role of flowers in the life cycle of plants. We've got lots to learn today, so you might want to just do this video in parts. There's two tasks that we'll be doing later. One is going to be labelling the parts of a flower, and the other is making a comic strip about the journey of a bee and how that helps to pollinate plants. So you can do those two parts separately if you want to. There's lots of science vocabulary in this, so pause the video whenever you need to. If you feel like it's going too fast, then you can pause it and you can watch it as many times as you want. It's much more important to understand fully what you're trying to learn than to rush through this, because we need to remember all of these words. So with that in mind, we're going to start with a review of the things that we learned last lesson. So for this, you're going to need a piece of paper. I'm presuming you've all got your exercise books from school, your line paper. So we're going to start with a review on that, and then we're going to go on to learning about flowers. Right, so of course the first thing we need to do is put our date, which for me is going to be Monday the 4th of May. It might be different from you, so if you're not doing it today, then do not write this date. Okay, and as always, I'm going to underline that very neatly with my ruler, making sure that my ruler is exactly on the line before I even start to write, and I'm holding it firmly. There. Okay, and the next thing we need to do, of course, is our learning objective, which is to explore the part that flowers play in the life cycle of flowering plants. And again, I'm going to underline that nice and neatly with my ruler. If you don't have a ruler, you can use a book or anything else that's straight. Okay, so because we're reviewing what we learned last lesson, I'm going to give this a little subheading just so that I know. And it's going to say simply review. And that's a subheading, so I'm going to underline that as well. Now, I'm going to give you a few words, and your task is to write a short sentence using that word. So let's start. The first word is going to be capillary action. And I'm going to help you with this one. So I'm going to do the first one. Capillary action is the process by which water is transported up the stem. That's capillary action. So I'm going to give you 4 more words now. I'm going to actually, before I do that, I'm going to underline this word to show that this is the important word, so that when you come to look back over your work, you'll be able to instantly see which the important word is. So your next word is going to be pores. Pores. So you need to write a sentence telling me all about what the pores are in the plant. The next word is carbon dioxide. Oops, I made a bit of a mistake there. The next word is photosynthesis. And your final word is chlorophyll. So I'm going to underline those. If you can remember the meanings of these words and why they are important, then you can go ahead and write a sentence about them. But if you need a bit of help, that's fine. You can go back over the last lesson that we did, and you can find out for yourself, because that's the point of a review. We see what we can remember, and if we can't remember it, then we go back and learn it. So if you're having trouble with these words, then you need to go back to the last video, maybe the one before, and refresh your memory. Okay, so these are my answers. Yours might be different because it depends on which way you've learnt them. So the way that I've written them might be different from you, but the basic idea should be the same. So capillary action, we've talked about, and that's the process by which water is transported up the stem. Pores are the tiny holes in the leaves that let water evaporate and air to enter the plant. Carbon dioxide is the chemical that the plant takes from the air and which it uses to make energy. Photosynthesis is the process of making energy from sunlight, carbon dioxide and water. And chlorophyll is the chemical which is found in leaves which lets them make energy from photosynthesis. And it also makes the leaves green. Okay, so if you were having any problems with these words, just go back, have a look at the other video and refresh your memory, because it's really important that we all understand what these words mean and that we can spell them as well. Also, my handwriting today is not very good because I'm holding a camera over my book and I'm looking around it, so I expect you to try your hardest to have your best handwriting for this. Okay, so let's start. Let's have a little look. I'm going to put a line under here because this is the end of the review. We're going to start the lesson now. If you want, because that might have taken a bit of time, if you want you can pause it and you can practice those spellings and those meanings, and you can come back to the rest of the video later. But I'm going to crack on right now. So our learning objective today, as we know, is to explore the part that flowers play in the life cycle of flowering plants. So a question for you. What do flowers actually do? What is their purpose? Pause the video now, have a think or a talk if you're with somebody, and have a little brainstorm about the things that you think flowers are there for. Okay, welcome back. I'm sure you had some great ideas. As usual, I'm really sad that I don't get to hear your ideas on the carpet. Hopefully that's going to end soon. For the time being, I'm just going to have to imagine all the fantastic creative ideas that you've had. So let's look into this and find out exactly what the purpose of flowers is. So a flower is the reproductive part of a plant. In a flower, pollen grains and egg cells combine and grow into seeds. This process is called pollination. So there's our first word, pollination. And it's a process. Whenever you see the word process, that means something's happening. It's an action. So we had the process of photosynthesis and the process of capillary action, and now we've got the process of pollination. And so that happens in the flower. Although the flowers of different plants can look very different, they have the same parts. Flowers contain both male and female reproductive parts. So we're going to look next at firstly the male parts of the flower and then the female parts of the flower, and then we're going to look at how pollination occurs between the two. So you might notice, if you look at the bottom of a flower, you've usually got the small green, they look like leaves, and that's called the sepals, and they protect the flower from I guess, bugs and the wind, and any other dangers that they've got. So, let's have a look at the male reproductive part. Altogether, this is called the stamen. So, you've got the petals on the outside and the stamen in the middle. It's the stem, and at the end of the stamen, you can see in this picture that it holds pollen grains on the anther. So the stamen is the whole thing all together, and the filament is the stalk that holds the anther, and the anther holds the pollen grains. So for pollination to occur, the pollen grains must come off the stamen and land on the female parts of the flower. So you can pause this and go over it. Feel free to go backwards. Make sure that you're reading it carefully and that you fully understand. I'm going to read through it quite quickly, but you have the power to stop it whenever you need to. So we've just learnt that, let's go back there, we've just learnt that pollination occurs when the pollen grains come off the stamen and land on the female part of the flower. But let's think, do we know some ways in which pollen grains can get from the male stamen onto the female parts of the flower? There are lots of different ways. Have a think, pause and have a think about that. Alright, so let's have a look. There are lots of ways. Pollen grains travel to the female parts of a flower in a number of ways. Some are blown by the wind. You can see the tiny, tiny dots there. So the wind is blowing it from one flower into the air and it'll get caught by another flower. Aquatic plants, that means plants in the water, they use water to carry their pollen. Some stick to insects that land on the flower. So I think we all know about bees, don't we? You can see on the back of the bee there, it's gone in there to drink the nectar, and it's got bits of pollen on its back, and then it's going to go to other flowers and it'll rub that pollen onto the female parts of the flower. Pollen grains can even be carried by birds and bats. So there's a hummingbird, I think, on the left, and it's drinking the nectar. It's got that really long beak, so it can get its beak right inside the flower, and it's getting the nectar, and it's getting tiny bits of pollen on its beak, and then it'll go to another flower and it'll leave that pollen accidentally on the female part of the flower. And I guess the bat does the same thing. So now we're going to look at the female part of the flower. We've looked at the male part, and now we're looking at the female part, and that's called the carpel. Most flowering plants rely on animals for pollination. They produce nectar, a food source for many insects. The smell of nectar and the colourful petals of the flower attract the insects. So the bees and the insects and the birds, they're flying through the air and they see the beautiful flowers, and then they smell the sweet nectar and they come for a drink. And then they accidentally leave bits of pollen from the male stamen all on the female carpel, which we'll learn about now. Let's look at the female part of the plant. So the carpel is the bit in the middle. It has three main parts: the ovary, the style, and the stigma. And you can see on the picture on the left, the ovary is right deep down inside at the bottom of the style. And the top is the sticky bit, and that's called the stigma, and that's what the plant is hoping bits of pollen will stick to. So it says pollen is often transferred to the stigma by insects landing on the flower. Pollen grains from another flower have stuck to their bodies and they rub off on the sticky stigma. So you're starting to get an idea of what's happening now, aren't you? So you can see the male parts, the stamen, they've got tiny little bits of powdery pollen on them. And then the animals, the insects, the birds, they will come in and they will drink the nectar from the flower, and they will get bits of pollen on their backs or on their beaks. And then they'll fly to another flower to drink the water there. And then when they're going down, bits of the pollen will rub off their backs or off their legs or off their beaks and onto the stigma at the top of the female part of the plant. So now we can see what happens. Once the pollen has gone on to the stigma, let's see what happens. Pollen grains that have landed on the stigma grow pollen tubes down the style. So you can see that there are no tubes, and then once they've been fertilized, they push down through the style all the way down until they get to the ovaries. So tiny packages of genetic information are transported down the pollen tubes to the ovary. There they combine with egg cells and they form a seed. And this process is called fertilization. So that's another really important word. So fertilization is what happens when you have the pollen from the male flower and it's landed onto the part of the female flower and it gets down into the ovary and it fertilizes the seed. So that's the beginning of life for the new plant then. Alright, so that was a lot of information and there were lots of new words there, and they are quite difficult words because scientific words, they're not the kind of words we use all the time, so we need to think quite carefully about how we use them. Even when I'm writing them, I double check after I've written it to make sure I've spelt it right, because I don't usually write some of these words, so I'm out of practice as well. So the more you can practice these, the more you're checking them, the more learning that you will achieve. So do not be afraid of going back and rewatching these videos. Let's have a look. So you will see that you have got on the website, there are these 3 worksheets. So because lots of us don't have printers, I'm going to be doing all of these, and I expect you to do these in your books instead. Now this activity, this task, it's saying to dissect a flower, and that means you're taking a flower to pieces and you're looking at each individual part of it. Now that's great, and if we're doing that in the classroom, I would have bought in some flowers from a florist and we could have done this, but I don't really want you going out and picking flowers from other people's gardens or from parks, because if everybody did that, we would end up with no flowers. And if you're picking them at a time before they've made seed, before they've been fertilized, we know now that they will not make seeds, so you could potentially be stopping them from making new flowers from next year. So if you have a garden, or if you have friends or relatives with a garden, then maybe you can do this. You can go and pick a flower and you can take it apart and you can stick it onto your book and then you can label it. But if you do not have a garden like me, and if you do not have any flowers knocking around like me, then we're going to do it in our book and we're going to draw a diagram of a flower. Now before you do this, you might want to go online, and if you type in BBC Bite-Size Flowering Plants Reproduce, you will find a video and a few short questions that can help you to increase your learning before you do this, or you can have a go now. So we're going to draw a diagram of a flower and then you're going to label it. Okay, so I've got enough space down here to put my diagram in, I think. If you found that your review has taken a bit more space, if you're down to here, then it's probably a better idea for you to turn over the page, just so you've got enough room. Alright, so when you're doing a diagram, it's much more important to be clear than to be realistic. So we're not looking for a realistic picture of a plant, we're just making sure that each part of it is nice and clear so that if anyone was looking at it, they can understand. And I'm just copying the picture that's on the screen at the moment, so you can do that as well. It's probably better if you copied that picture rather than my picture, because my picture will probably not be as good. Okay, so I have my pollen. Yeah, so it doesn't have to be a fantastic picture as long as it's nice and clear. So now I'm going to get my ruler to draw the lines just to make it really, really clear. Okay, so now I've drawn my picture. You might want to go away and do your own now. So you can look at the screen. Don't click onto the next slide because that's going to give you the answers. So it's really important that you try your hardest to remember this. If you're finding it difficult, then go back and watch the whole presentation again, watch the lesson again, go onto the BBC Bite Size website, and then come back and try again. Okay. I wonder how you did. I really would like you to send pictures of these so that I can keep an eye on how well you're all doing. Okay, so I'm going to start doing mine with the male reproductive part of the plant. So I'm going to put a line here going into my filament and a line going to my anther, and a little nice neat arrow. Okay, so this we know is the anther. And this long stem here, this is the filament. And together, the anther and the filament, they make up the male reproductive part of the plant, which is called the, oh, you can't see mine there, which is called the stamen. Okay, so these together, this bit here, this is the male part of the plant, and here, you've got the anther. And remember that on top of the anthers, you've got all of the pollen dust on there. Okay, now let's look at the female parts of the plant. So that's the bit in the middle. So down here we can see that this is the ovary, and the ovary is where the plant keeps its eggs. Ovary. Now, just like the male stamen part of the plant has this filament holding up the anther, so too does the female part. It has this thicker stem called a style. And then on top of the style, the female part of the plant has got the stigma. Okay. So I'm going to put this little bracket around there, and that's just going to show that these three parts of the plant are all part of the female reproductive organs, which we call the carpel. Can you see that? Carpel. So we have the female reproductive organs in the middle, called the carpel, which is made up of the stigma, the style, and the ovary. And we've got the male reproduction, which is called the stamen, and that's made of the filament and the anther, and of course, tiny bits of pollen on the end. Now let's just label these other bits just so that we know. So these bits you can't see, I haven't coloured them in. They would be a lovely bright colour to attract all the insects. And these are the petals, the bits that you can see, the colourful bits on the plant. And this green bit under here, this is the sepal. And that's the bit that before the plant opens, it's a little bud, and that green outside of the bud stays on the bottom of the flower, and it just protects the flower. Okay, so I'm really looking forward to seeing your wonderful pictures. That's my labelled diagram of a flower. It's really important that you learn all of these words. I know it's a lot, but you can practice them by writing them down and then covering them and then trying to write them again, and you can try writing descriptions about what each word means, but it's really important that you go back and keep practicing these. Okay, so once you've got your diagram, or if you've got a garden, once you've done your sticking and dissecting, we're going to go on to the next task. Okay, so here's that diagram again, and if you couldn't read my handwriting or you couldn't see my picture properly, here's the words labelled for you. So you can see again there you've got the female carpel and the male stamen and all the parts within that. So our next task, you can see on the worksheet, if you've managed to print these worksheets out by the way, then you can do them on the worksheets, but I'm going to assume you haven't all got printers because I certainly don't have a printer and I don't know anyone that does. So I'm going to be doing all of this on my book, in my bits of paper. So the next task is you're going to draw a comic strip, and that's going to show how the bee pollinates a flower. So you can look at worksheet 4A, B or C to help you. They've got more or less support there, so I'll leave that up to you to choose the one that you think is most appropriate. Again, if you're doing this in your book, then we're going to need to use our rulers to draw some nice boxes. Yep, so there's definitely not enough space on this page to do that, so I'm going to turn over. If you've got plain paper lying around, then it might be nice to do it on the plain paper. I don't, unfortunately. I'm not very prepared at home at all. Okay, so here's my nice clean page. You don't need a new LO and you don't need a new date because it's the same lesson. But what I am going to do is I'm going to give myself a subheading. And I'm going to call it How do bee pollinate? How do bees pollinate flowers? Just so that when I'm going through my book later, I know exactly what's going on each page. Okay, so I think there are going to be 6 boxes. So what I'm going to do, it's up to you, you can do yours a bit differently. I'm going to count how many lines there are from here to here. There are 33 lines, so I know, because I know my 11 times table, that if I've got 33 lines, and I divide that by 3, then each one of these is going to have to be 11 lines. So I'm going to count down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So now I've divided my page into 3 equal sections, and I'm going to draw a line to separate them. All the way to the end. I want to see all of you, by the way, writing all the way to the end of the page and starting right at the margin. I do not want to see people starting their writing in the middle of the page, please. Okay, so now I've got my page split into 3, and I need to find halfway through, so I'm going to use my ruler, and this is good practice because we were learning measurements, weren't we? Hopefully you'll have a longer ruler. Mine is only 18, so if I go 18 plus 2, half of 18, you should know your 9 times table. 2 9s is 18, so I'm going to put a line at 9 here, and I'm going to put a line at 9 here. And when I join these 2 dots, they will be perfectly straight because I've measured them both at exactly 9 centimeters from the margin. Your pages might be slightly different to this, so it's important that you measure your own pages, and you've definitely got enough maths to be able to do this. I'm rushing mine a bit, so it's a bit messy, so I want to see you taking time. Alright, so now I've got my grid for my comic strip. So I will leave you to get up to do this yourself, because you can use the information that we've learnt now, or you can use the bite-sized one online to look into this, and we'll come back maybe on Wednesday or Thursday, and I'll show you what I've done. Okay, year 3, good luck. Bye.